I knew it was wrong. I knew it could ruin everything. But I couldn't stop. My stepfather, Jack, became the one thing I couldn't resist and my biggest mistake. My name is Eliza. I'm 19 and I've always been used to attention. But with Jack, it was different. He wasn't just any man, he was married to my mom. That made him forbidden, untouchable, which only made me want him more. I started noticing the way he looked at me. Subtle glances when he thought I wasn't paying attention. The slight tension in his voice when we spoke. It gave me a thrill, a sense of control I had never felt before. And that evening, when my mom texted that she'd be late from work, I decided to take a risk. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, the soft sound of my bare feet on the tile echoing in the quiet house. Jack was sitting at the counter, his laptop open, a glass of wine beside him. He barely glanced up at first, but when I opened the fridge, his eyes lingered. I knew he saw me. I was wearing a short silk robe that clung to my body, just barely tied at the waist. "Late night?" I asked, casually grabbing a bottle of water. "Something like that," he replied, his voice steady but his eyes betraying him. I turned, leaning slightly against the counter, letting the robe part just enough to reveal more than I should. "You should take a break. You've been working so hard." He didn't answer right away, but I could feel his gaze on me. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Where's your mom?" he asked finally, his tone almost too casual. "She'll be late," I said, taking a slow sip of water. "It's just us tonight." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, as if realizing he had been staring too long, he stood abruptly. "I should probably finish this," he muttered, gesturing to his laptop. "Suit yourself," I replied, shrugging. But as he walked past me, I couldn't help but let my fingers brush against his arm, just enough to make him stop. "Good night, Jack," I said softly, looking up at him with a faint smile. His eyes met mine, and for a second, I thought he was going to say something. But instead, he shook his head and walked away. I stood there, heart pounding, knowing I had just crossed a line. But the thrill was undeniable. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the way he looked at me, the way his voice faltered when he spoke. I wanted more. I needed to know how far I could push him before he broke. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen again, making coffee. This time, I didn't hesitate. "Morning," I said brightly, leaning against the counter in my shortest tank top and shorts. "Morning," he replied, barely glancing at me. But I could tell he was trying not to look. "Do you need any help?" I asked, stepping closer. "No," he said quickly, his voice firm. But when I brushed past him to grab a mug, I felt his breath hitch. "Are you okay, Jack?" I asked, turning to face him, feigning innocence. "Eliza," he started, but his voice trailed off. I smiled, taking a sip of my coffee. "Relax. It's just breakfast." But we both knew it wasn't. From that moment, the game began. I started testing him, pushing the boundaries a little more each day. And while he tried to keep his distance, I could see the cracks forming. I didn't know where this would lead, but I was determined to find out. And trust me, it gets even crazier from here. I came down the stairs, the soft rustle of my short silk robe barely audible over the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The house was calm, and the air felt charged, as though it knew something was about to happen. Jack was at the counter, chopping vegetables with precision, his expression as serious and focused as always. But I knew better. I had seen the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I stopped in the doorway, pretending to stretch, letting the robe shift slightly to reveal more skin than necessary. "Hey," I said casually, walking over to the counter. He glanced up, his jaw tightening for a split second before returning his focus to the cutting board. "Hey," he replied, his tone neutral. I leaned against the counter, watching him work, my robe slipping slightly at the shoulder. "You've been at this for a while. How much longer are you planning to work?" I asked, my voice soft, almost teasing. He didn't look up, but I saw the way his grip on the knife tightened. "Not much longer," he said. Just trying to get everything ready before your mom gets home." "Oh, you're so helpful," I said, letting a hint of sarcasm creep into my tone. I picked up the wine glass sitting on the counter, swirling the liquid before taking a slow sip. "She's lucky to have you." He didn't respond, but his shoulders stiffened ever so slightly. I took a step closer, brushing past him under the pretense of reaching for a plate. My arm grazed his, and I felt the tension ripple through him like a wave. "Oops, sorry," I said with a small smile, holding the plate in my hand. "It's fine," he muttered, keeping his eyes on the vegetables. I leaned forward slightly, setting the plate down on the counter, deliberately letting my robe part just enough to draw his attention. "Jack," I said, biting my lip, "do you ever get tired of being the perfect husband?" That question made him pause. He set the knife down carefully, turning to face me for the first time. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something conflicted, something dangerous. "Eliza," he said slowly, his tone firm but low, "what are you doing?" I shrugged, taking another sip of wine. "Just making conversation." "This isn't a conversation," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. I smiled, tilting my head. "What is it, then?" For a moment, he didn't answer. The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we weren't saying. Finally, he shook his head, picking up the knife again. "I think you should go," he said, his voice tense. "Why?" I asked, stepping closer. "Are you uncomfortable?" His jaw tightened, and he set the knife down again, more forcefully this time. "Eliza, don't play games with me." I laughed softly, setting the wine glass back on the counter. "I'm not playing games, Jack. I'm just talking." I moved past him again, this time letting my hand rest on his arm for just a moment longer than necessary. He didn't pull away, but he didn't look at me either. "Good night, Jack," I said, my voice soft and deliberate. As I walked out of the kitchen, I glanced back to see him standing there, frozen, his hands still on the counter. I smiled to myself, knowing that I had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the scene in my head. The way he tensed when I touched him, the way his voice wavered ever so slightly. It was working. But I wasn't done yet. The next day, I made sure I was alone with Jack. My mom had left for a meeting, and the house was quiet, just the two of us. I had planned everything carefully, how I'd look, how I'd act, every word I'd say. I slipped into a dress that hugged my figure in all the right places and settled onto the couch with a book, pretending to read. But my real focus was on the sound of Jack's footsteps as he moved around the house. When he finally walked into the room, I didn't look up immediately. I waited, letting him notice me first. "Are you just going to sit there all day?" he asked, his tone casual but slightly curious. I glanced up from my book, giving him a small smile. "What else is there to do? It's so boring here when no one's around." His eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than they should have, and I felt a thrill run through me. "Maybe you could find something productive to do," he suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. I shrugged, leaning back slightly on the couch. "Maybe. Or maybe I'll just wait for something interesting to happen." As he walked past me, I leaned forward, pretending to adjust my book. The movement brought us closer than necessary, and I could feel the tension between us like an invisible thread. "Excuse me," he muttered, stepping around me quickly. I watched him head toward the kitchen, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Jack," I called out, my voice soft and playful. He paused in the doorway but didn't turn around. "What is it?" "Nothing," I said, suppressing a smirk. "Just wanted to make sure you're okay." He didn't respond, but I saw the way his shoulders tensed before he walked away. When he returned a few minutes later with a glass of water, I had shifted my position on the couch, crossing my legs in a way that made the hem of my dress ride up slightly. "Do you need something?" he asked, his voice tight. "No," I replied, looking up at him with an innocent expression. "Just enjoying the peace and quiet." His eyes flicked to my legs for the briefest moment before he quickly looked away. I decided to push further. "You know," I said, setting my book down, "it's nice to have some company for once. It gets lonely around here." "You're not alone that often," he replied, his tone guarded. "But when I am," I said, leaning forward slightly, "it's nice to know you're here." He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "Eliza, I don't think." "Don't think too much," I interrupted, my voice soft. "It's just a conversation." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words. I could tell he was struggling, caught between what he wanted and what he knew was wrong. Finally, he cleared his throat and stood up. "I have work to do," he said, walking toward the door. "Okay," I said, smiling to myself as he left. As the door closed behind him, I leaned back on the couch, feeling a sense of satisfaction. I wasn't sure how far I could take this game, but I was enjoying every second of it. What I didn't realize then was that I was no longer in control. I decided it was time to test him, to see how close I could get to breaking through his carefully controlled demeanor. That evening, with my mom out running errands, I waited until we were alone in the kitchen. The tension in the air was already palpable, but I wanted to see how far I could take it. "Jack," I called out, holding up a jar of marinara sauce. "Can you help me with this? I can never get these open." He glanced at me from across the room, hesitating for a moment before walking over. "Sure," he said, his voice steady but his movements cautious. As he reached for the jar, our hands brushed. The contact was brief, but it sent a spark through me. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers linger just a moment longer than necessary, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Thanks," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You're always so helpful." He froze for a second, his grip tightening on the jar. Then he twisted the lid off with more force than necessary and handed it back to me, his gaze fixed on the counter. "There," he said, his tone clipped. "All done." But I wasn't finished. As I reached for the jar, I deliberately let my fingers brush his again, locking eyes with him this time. "You always know how to get things done," I said, my voice dropping just slightly. His jaw tightened, and he stepped back abruptly, putting as much distance between us as the small kitchen would allow. "Eliza," he said, his voice cold and firm, "don't do that again." "Do what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "You know exactly what I mean," he snapped, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. "Stop playing these games." I tilted my head, pretending to be confused. "I'm not playing games, Jack. I just needed help with the jar." His expression darkened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something else. But instead, he turned and walked toward the sink, his movements stiff and deliberate. "I'm serious, Eliza," he said without turning around. "Don't do this again." His reaction only made me smile. He was so close to breaking, and I could see it. The way his shoulders tensed, the way he avoided looking at me, it was clear he was struggling to maintain control. But I wasn't done yet. "Okay," I said, my tone light and playful. "Whatever you say, Jack." As he left the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, the jar of sauce still in my hand. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through me, a mix of excitement and satisfaction. He was on edge, teetering on the brink, and I wanted to see how far I could push him before he fell. What I didn't realize was that I was already dangerously close to crossing a line I couldn't uncross. That evening, the air in the house felt different. My mom had texted to say she'd be working late, leaving just me and Jack alone. I had been preparing for this moment, and tonight, I decided, was the night to take the final step. I found him in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book in his hands. The soft glow of the lamp highlighted the tension in his posture. He didn't notice me at first, so I lingered in the doorway, letting him feel my presence. "Hey," I said softly, stepping into the room. He glanced up, his expression guarded. "Hey. Your mom's still at work?" I nodded, moving closer, my heart racing. "Yeah. It's just us." I sat down next to him, closer than I needed to. The space between us vanished, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He stiffened but didn't move away. "I feel like we've been avoiding something," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Eliza," he said sharply, closing the book and placing it on the table. "We can't." I didn't let him finish. I reached out, my hand brushing against his arm. "Jack, don't pretend anymore," I said, looking into his eyes. He froze, his jaw tightening. I could see the conflict in his face, the battle between what he knew was right and what he wanted. I leaned in, my voice dropping even lower. "You feel it too, don't you?" He didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. I moved closer, our faces inches apart. I could feel his breath on my skin, shallow and uneven. My heart was pounding, a mix of fear, excitement, and something I couldn't name. "Tell me to stop," I whispered, giving him one last chance. He didn't. Instead, he closed the remaining distance between us, his lips brushing against mine. The kiss was tentative at first, as though he was still fighting with himself. But then it deepened, and all the tension that had built over the past weeks exploded into that single moment. His hands found their way to my waist, pulling me closer. My fingers tangled in his shirt, clutching him as though I was afraid he might pull away. The world outside disappeared. There was only us, caught in a moment we couldn't take back. When it was over, the silence in the room was deafening. Jack pulled away first, his expression a mix of guilt and something else I couldn't place. "This can't happen again," he said, his voice trembling. I nodded, but inside, I was reeling. I had thought this would feel like a victory, like I had won some unspoken game. But instead, all I felt was a deep, sinking dread. I stood up, wrapping my arms around myself. "Jack, Don't," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "We can't talk about this. It has to stay between us." I nodded again, unable to speak. My mind was racing, replaying everything that had just happened. As I walked out of the room, I felt a chill run down my spine. I had gotten what I wanted, but it didn't feel the way I had imagined. Later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't stop the thoughts from swirling in my head. What have I done? How could I let this happen? I knew, even then, that everything had changed. And there was no going back. A few days passed, but something in the house shifted. My mom, usually cheerful and chatty, had become distant. Her glances grew colder, her words shorter. I could feel her suspicion creeping into every interaction. Jack wasn't the same either. He avoided me, keeping conversations strictly functional and brief. When we did cross paths, his tone was sharp, almost angry. The game I thought I was controlling had spiraled far beyond my grasp. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, the tension was unbearable. My mom put down her fork, her eyes fixed on me. "Eliza," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "is there something you need to tell me?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Why would you ask that?" She didn't answer, just stared at me for a long moment before turning her attention back to her plate. But her question lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. My mom left for work as usual, but the way she looked at me before she walked out the door made my stomach twist. Jack stayed locked in his office for most of the day, barely acknowledging my presence. By the afternoon, I was restless. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, the weight of what I had done pressing down harder with each passing minute. Then it happened. I was in the kitchen when my mom came home earlier than expected. I heard the front door open and her footsteps in the hallway. Before I could react, she walked in and saw Jack and me standing close, locked in a heated argument. "Stop blaming me," I was saying, my voice raised. "You started this," he shot back, his tone harsh. The moment she entered, silence fell. Her eyes darted between us, and I saw the realization hit her like a tidal wave. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice icy. Neither of us answered. The look on her face shifted from confusion to anger, then to something darker, a realization that shattered everything. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice rising. "What have you two been doing?" "Nothing," Jack said quickly, his tone desperate. "It's not what you think." But she wasn't buying it. "Eliza," she said, turning to me. "Tell me the truth. Right now." I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The weight of her stare, the fury in her eyes, left me paralyzed. Unbelievable, she muttered, stepping back as if the sight of us physically repelled her. Both of you. How could you do this to me? Mary, Jack started, but she cut him off with a raised hand. Don't, she snapped, her voice trembling with rage. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Her gaze turned back to me, and for the first time, I saw her not as my mother but as someone who could destroy me. You think you're so clever, she said, her tone dripping with venom. You've ruined everything, Eliza. Everything. That night, she made her decision. Jack's things were packed into bags and thrown into the hallway. She told him to leave and never come back. As for me, the punishment wasn't so simple. You're not welcome here anymore, she said, her voice cold and final. You wanted to play your little games? Now you can deal with the consequences. I begged her to reconsider, tears streaming down my face, but she wouldn't listen. You're not my daughter anymore, she said, her words cutting deeper than any wound. Jack left that night, his car disappearing down the street. I stayed in my room, the silence of the house broken only by the sound of my own sobs. The next morning, I packed my things. My mom didn't say a word as I walked out the door. As I stood on the sidewalk, my suitcase in hand, I realized just how far I had fallen. The game I thought I was playing had cost me everything, my family, my home, my sense of self. And I had no one to blame but myself. My mom didn't hesitate. The moment the truth clicked for her, everything unraveled. She didn't want to hear explanations or excuses. The look on her face told me that no amount of words could undo what I had done. She packed Jack's things that night, shoving them into bags with a fury I had never seen before. He stood in the doorway, trying to reason with her, but she wasn't listening. Get out, she said coldly, throwing the last bag at his feet. I don't care where you go. Just leave. He looked at me one last time, but I couldn't meet his gaze. And then he was gone. I thought that would be the end of it, but my mom wasn't finished. When she turned to me, her eyes were filled with a different kind of anger, one that cut deeper than words. You thought this was a game, Eliza, she said, her voice shaking. You destroyed everything. Do you even understand what you've done? Mom, I didn't mean, I started, but she held up a hand to silence me. Don't, she snapped. I don't want to hear it. You've ruined this family, and for what? A moment of selfishness? Her words stung, but they were nothing compared to what she said next. I can't even look at you, she said, her voice breaking. You're not the daughter I thought I had. You're a stranger to me now. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the full weight of what I had done. I had lost her trust, her love, and any chance of repairing our relationship. She didn't kick me out that night, but the house no longer felt like home. The silence was suffocating, and her cold glances were a constant reminder of my betrayal. I left the next morning. Standing on the sidewalk with my suitcase, I felt the crushing reality of what I had done. I had no one to turn to, nowhere to go. The life I had known was gone, and I had no one to blame but myself. Now, looking back, I understand how foolish I was. I thought I was in control, that I could play with fire without getting burned. But my actions didn't just hurt me, they destroyed everything I cared about. My so-called game turned into a disaster I couldn't escape. And now, I have a question for you. Have you ever made a choice you wish you could take back? A moment that changed everything? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your stories.